Welcome to this explainer. Picture this, July 2nd, 1937. The absolute most famous female pilot on the planet just vanishes. Literally mid-flight, mid-sentence, right over the vast Pacific Ocean. Today, we're diving deep into the anatomy of a mystery, dissecting aviation's most enduring and honestly most theorized disappearance. So it's July 2, 1937. As soon as she goes quiet, the U.S. kicks off what was, up to that point, the largest and most unbelievably expensive search operation in history. And the result? Nothing. Not a single confirmed trace of her plane. Now we're nearly 90 years out, this case is actually still officially open, and let me tell you, the real evidence is way stranger than what you usually hear. Okay, Section 1, a global aviation superstar. Let's first get a grip on exactly who was sitting in that cockpit and why this specific flight was such a huge deal. Because by 1937, Amelia Earhart wasn't just some pilot, right? She was a global superstar. I mean, her resume is just staggering. In 1932, she's the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She's smashing speed and distance records left and right, writing best-selling books and doing celebrity product endorsements. But what's really cool is how she deliberately weaponized that fame, using her massive platform to fiercely advocate for women in aviation, which, as you can imagine, was a totally male-dominated boys' club back then. And her final project? Absolutely breathtaking in its ambition. She wanted to be the first woman to fly around the entire world at its widest point, right around the equator. To put that into perspective, that route is a staggering 29,000 miles. This wasn't just a PR stunt. It was supposed to be her final, ultimate triumph before hanging up her record-setting goggles. For this massive undertaking, she's flying a heavily modified, twin-engine Lockheed Electra, and she brings along Fred Noonan, a super experienced Pan Am navigator. Which brings us to Section 2, the doomed final flight. Let's trace how this incredibly triumphant journey slowly morphed into an absolute tragedy. So by late June of 37, Earhart and Noonan are crushing it. They've knocked out about 2/3 of this massive journey, crossing Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But then on July 2nd, they take off from Lae, New Guinea, pointing the nose toward Holland Island. Now, everybody knew this Pacific leg was the danger zone. It was easily the riskiest part of the whole trip because of the huge stretches of open water between these tiny, tiny islands. There was virtually zero margin for error, and the timeline takes a really chilling turn at exactly 8:43 a.m. local time. That was her final confirmed radio transmission. What happens in those final hours is a completely fatal communication breakdown. On one side of the radio, Earhart's Electra is blasting out these increasingly desperate messages. She's reporting low fuel, saying she literally cannot see the island. On the flip side, down below, you have the Coast Guard cutter Itasca. They were stationed near Holland specifically to guide her in. They are hearing her voice perfectly fine, but for some reason, Earhart is completely deaf to their frantic responses. Maybe it was weird atmospheric conditions, an antenna issue, or just a tragic mix-up with radio frequencies. But the connection was totally broken one way. And that brings us to the very last confirmed thing we know she said, picked up at 8:43 a.m. We are flying on the line of position, north and south. I just want you to pause and let those words sink in for a second. She's up there, flying along a mathematical line on a map, desperately squinting out the window to spot a tiny speck of land before her engines choke from lack of fuel. It makes this abstract navigational problem feel so incredibly real and, frankly, terrifying. Because right after she said that, nothing but complete silence. Moving to Section 3, the massive search effort. As you can guess, that sudden silence triggered an immediate, totally frantic military response. Just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this challenge. The target here, Howland Island, is this tiny, completely flat, unbelievably remote strip of land, a full 2,556 miles away from her starting point. Finding it was like finding a needle in an ocean-sized haystack. When she went silent, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard went all out. We're talking the battleship USS Colorado, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, scouring 250,000 square miles of open ocean over roughly 2 weeks. It was the most extensive search in American history at that point, and the result? Absolutely nothing. So by July 19th, the search is officially called off. The government puts forward what becomes known as the crash and sink theory. It basically says the heavy Lockheed Electra starved of fuel, hit the water, and because of its weight and build, sank to the bottom pretty fast. Now here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. This is still the most widely accepted explanation among historians and investigators today. But, and this is a huge but, it has never actually been definitively proven by finding physical wreckage. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, competing disappearance theories. Because that total lack of confirmed wreckage left a massive void, and as we know, human nature loves to fill a void with theories. Let's weigh the evidence. Easily the most prominent alternative to the official story is the Nikumaroro hypothesis. This is championed by a research group called TIGHR. Their idea is that Earhart and Noonan, realizing they couldn't find Howland Island, followed that exact radial line of position we talked about earlier. And that line, it leads right to a different, totally uninhabited atoll called Gardner Island, which we now know as Nikumaroro. The theory goes that they managed to land the plane on an exposed reef flat during low tide and actually lived out their final days as castaways on this deserted island. Now, there is a serious, really fascinating tug of war here between the evidence and the critiques. On paper, the evidence sounds like a slam dunk, right? A partial human skeleton found in 1940, artifacts from the 1930s, and a whole bunch of post-disappearance radio distress calls that modern researchers say were highly likely to be genuine. But wait, because the critiques hit back hard. Those bones found in 1940, they were completely lost to history, so modern DNA testing is totally off the table. And those cool artifacts? Skeptics point out they could very easily just be trash left behind by British colonial settlers who lived on that exact same island between 1938 and 1963. Still, when you zoom in on these physical artifacts pulled from the island, the details give you goosebumps. That partial human skeleton discovered by a British officer in 1940? At the time, they used some pretty flawed, outdated forensic methods to declare it male. But modern experts looking at the original bone measurements say, actually, scratch that, the dimensions perfectly match a woman of Earhart's exact height and build. They also found a heel from a 1930s-style woman's shoe, a busted pocket knife, and pieces of a glass jar. And that jar is the real kicker. It perfectly matched a specific brand of American freckle cream. And guess what? Amelia Earhart was known to actively use that exact kind of product. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Okay, we also need to talk about another huge elephant in the room, the Japanese capture theory. This is the idea that Earhart and Noonan crash-landed way off course in the Marshall Islands, were captured by the Japanese military, and held hostage on Saipan. People love this one. It's been the focus of so many books and documentaries. But looking at the historical reality, we have to be objective here. Professional historians almost universally reject this. There is literally zero verified physical evidence to back it up. Plus, from a pure physics standpoint, the plane's fuel range makes that flight path practically impossible based on where we know she was.
So, where does that leave us? Section 5. The modern search continues. Let's look at exactly what investigators are doing about this right now. Because nearly 9 decades later, this is still a fully active, totally open investigation. Teams today are launching massive expeditions to map out the insanely deep ocean approaches around Howland Island, as well as the steep underwater drop-offs near Nikumaroro. We're talking cutting-edge sonar and crazy advanced autonomous underwater drones. And look, every few years, a weird sonar blip makes headlines, the internet goes completely wild, and everyone thinks we finally found it. But unfortunately, as of the latest expeditions, every single one of those anomalies has turned out to be a rock formation or remains completely unconfirmed once they send cameras down. Not a single piece of verified electro wreckage has ever been found. Which leaves us right back where we started, staring down one massive, provocative question. Did Earhart just quietly sink to the dark ocean floor, exactly where the Navy assumed she did back in '37? Or does the vast expanse of the Pacific still hide her true final landing place? Look, statistically, the most boring explanation is probably the right one. She just ran out of gas. But that stubborn, absolute absence of wreckage, it leaves the door open just a crack for these other, wilder realities to exist. It means one of the most famous women of the 20th century is still out there waiting to be found. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity, and I highly encourage you to go dig into the evidence for yourself.